Hello everyone. I am the boring historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the shadowy corridors of medieval castles and palaces, behind the glittering facades of royal courts and noble houses, lurked some of history's most monstrous fathers. These men, kings, emperors, sultans, and lords, wielded absolute power not only over their realms but also over their own families, often with devastating consequences. Their stories reveal a disturbing truth: that for many medieval rulers, the bonds of fatherhood were secondary to the pursuit of power, security, and legacy. This exposé delves into the darkest chapters of medieval family history, spanning Europe, the Middle East, and Asia from 500 to 1500 AD. Here we encounter fathers who imprisoned, exiled, mutilated, and murdered their own children, who sacrificed their sons and daughters to political ambition, who inflicted psychological torture that scarred generations, and who betrayed the most fundamental duty of parenthood: to protect one's offspring from harm. Some of these men are remembered as great rulers despite, or perhaps because of, their ruthlessness. Others are reviled as tyrants whose cruelty knew no bounds, not even when it came to their own flesh and blood. All of them, however, stand as grim reminders of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how even the sacred bond between father and child can be perverted by the dark forces of ambition, paranoia, and the brutal logic of medieval power politics. For centuries, Constantine I has been venerated as the first Christian emperor who transformed the Roman world. Yet behind this glorious legacy lies a dark shadow: the murder of his own son, Crispus, in 326 AD. Crispus was Constantine's eldest son, born to his first wife Minervina. Handsome, intelligent, and martially gifted, Crispus distinguished himself in battle against the Franks and against Constantine's rival Licinius. By all accounts, he was being groomed as Constantine's successor until catastrophe struck. In 326 AD, rumors began circulating that Crispus was engaged in an illicit relationship with his stepmother, Empress Fausta. Whether these rumors were true or, as some historians suggest, fabricated by Fausta to eliminate a rival to her own son's inheritance, Constantine's response was swift and merciless. Without public trial or investigation, he ordered his son's arrest in May, and Crispus was executed by poison shortly thereafter. Not content with merely taking his son's life, Constantine ordered a damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of erasing a person from history. Crispus's name was struck from official records and inscriptions, his statues destroyed, and his memory condemned to oblivion. In a cruel twist, just months later, Constantine had Fausta killed as well, suffocated in an overheated bath. The psychological impact on Constantine's remaining children must have been profound. What lesson could they take from their father's actions, except that their lives hung by a thread, dependent entirely on their father's favor, and subject to the deadly court intrigues that surrounded them? "I shall fall upon your family like a lion pouncing on a large prey, and I shall exact fitting revenge for the injuries I have sustained at your hands." These chilling words from Andronicus with Komnenos, 1183 to 1185, reveal the mentality of a man consumed by vengeance, who would stop at nothing, including the murder of his own relatives, to secure power. Having spent years imprisoned by family members, Andronicus worked his way back to power in Byzantium with one goal: elimination of the imperial family that had wronged him. Andronicus's brief reign was characterized by paranoia, sexual depravity, including incestuous relationships, and increasingly savage reprisals against anyone he perceived as a threat. Described by contemporaries as A man of violence, cruelty, mutilation, and murder, Andronicus created a state of terror within Constantinople, executing nobles and officials on the slightest pretext. Most disturbing was his treatment of the child emperor Alexios II, of whom Andronicus was supposed to be guardian and protector. After forcing the 12-year-old boy to sign the death warrants for his own mother and sister, Andronicus had the child strangled with a bowstring. He then displayed the body to the court, kicking it and denouncing the boy's parentage. Not satisfied with this atrocity, Andronicus married the child's 12-year-old widow, Agnes Anna of France. Andronicus's reign of terror finally ended when a mob in Constantinople captured him. His death matched the cruelty of his life. He was tortured for 3 days before being torn apart by the furious citizenry. His legacy stands as one of the darkest chapters in Byzantine history, a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger to royal children came from those who should have been their protectors. Among Byzantine emperors, the practice of blinding political rivals was common, but few fathers went so far as to blind their own sons. Yet this is precisely what Emperor Isaac II Angelos threatened to do to his son and heir, Alexios, when the young man fled Constantinople to seek Western help against his uncle who had usurped Isaac's throne. When Isaac was restored to power with Western help, his mental state had deteriorated during imprisonment. Paranoid and vengeful, he turned against his son Alexios IV, who had brought the Western Crusaders to Constantinople. The resulting tensions between father and son, and their mutual inability to fulfill promises made to their Western allies, led to disaster. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, one of the greatest catastrophes in Byzantine history. While Isaac did not ultimately blind his son, both were killed by a usurper. His threat to do so, and his treatment of Alexios upon their reunion, reveals a toxic father-son relationship that contributed directly to the downfall of the Byzantine Empire. Isaac, in prioritizing his own resentments over his son's welfare or the stability of the empire, stands as an example of how paternal failure at the highest levels could have world historical consequences. Before becoming king, John had already betrayed and rebelled against his father Henry II and brother Richard I. His reign is marked by his imprisoning and probable murder of his nephew Arthur, losing Normandy, and having his English subjects rebel and force him to sign the Magna Carta. John Lackland of England, R. 1199–1216, stands as one of medieval Europe's most reviled monarchs, described by a contemporary chronicler as making hell itself fouler by his presence. His cruelty extended beyond political enemies to include his own family, most notably in his treatment of his nephew Arthur of Brittany. Arthur, the son of John's deceased elder brother Geoffrey, had a stronger claim to the English throne than John himself. When John seized the crown following Richard I's death in 1199, the 12-year-old Arthur became a dangerous rival, especially when supported by King Philip II of France. In 1202, John captured Arthur after a battle at Mirabeau. What happened next remains one of the darkest mysteries of medieval English history. According to contemporary chroniclers, John, drunk and in a rage, personally murdered Arthur, either stabbing him with a dagger or bludgeoning him to death before tying a heavy stone to the body and throwing it into the Seine. Other accounts suggest Arthur was blinded and castrated before being imprisoned, where he eventually died. The murder of Arthur, a child under John's care and his own brother's son, shocked medieval Europe, where kinslaying was considered an especially heinous crime. Philip of France used the outrage to strip John of his continental possessions, while the stain on John's character contributed to the baronial rebellion that produced Magna Carta. John's poor fatherhood extended to his legitimate children as well. His son, the future Henry III, was just 9 when John died of dysentery in 1216, leaving the boy to inherit a kingdom torn by civil war and foreign invasion. A disastrous legacy from a father who had prioritized his own ambitions over his family's and kingdom's welfare. Pedro I of Castile, r. 1350 to 1369, known to history as Pedro the Cruel, earned his sobriquet through a reign of terror that spared neither political opponents nor family members. His paranoia and brutality created a climate of fear that extended even to his own children. Pedro's treatment of his wife, Blanche of Bourbon, sets the tone for his character as husband and father. After marrying her in 1353, he abandoned her 3 days after the wedding to return to his mistress, Maria de Padilla. Blanche was imprisoned, and after years of confinement, she was murdered in 1361 on Pedro's orders, either poisoned or crossbow shot by a ballestero. But Pedro's cruelty extended beyond his wife to include his half-brothers. In 1358, he lured his half-brother Fadrique to Seville with promises of reconciliation. As Fadrique greeted Pedro in the Alcazar, the king ordered his guards to kill him. Not satisfied with this, Pedro presided over a banquet immediately afterward, while his brother's body was still warm in the next room. For Pedro's legitimate children with Blanche, and his many illegitimate children with Maria de Padilla and others, life was precarious. Growing up in a court where their father might order executions on a whim, where family bonds provided no protection, and where their own positions were constantly threatened by their father's instability, these children experienced a childhood of constant terror. Pedro's legacy as a father was cut short by his own violent death in 1369, when he was stabbed to death by his half-brother Enrique in a personal combat at Montiel. His death in the same manner he had inflicted on so many others seemed to contemporary chroniclers like divine justice for his many crimes, including those against his own family. Philip IV of France, r. and 1285-1314, known as Philip the Fair for his handsome appearance, has a reputation for cold, calculating cruelty that extended to his treatment of his own daughters. In pursuit of political advantage and financial gain, Philip orchestrated one of the most notorious scandals of the medieval period, forever tarnishing his daughters' reputations and destroying their lives. In 1314, Philip accused his 3 daughters-in-law of adultery in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. Marguerite of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy, the wives of Philip's sons Louis and Charles, were imprisoned after being accused of adultery with 2 knights. The 3rd daughter-in-law, Joan of Burgundy, was accused of knowing about the affairs and failing to report them. While the accusations may have had some basis in fact, most historians believe Philip greatly exaggerated or even fabricated elements of the scandal to achieve political ends, including control over the Burgundian inheritance, and to dissolve marriages that no longer served his purposes. The knights accused of being the princess's lovers were tortured horribly, then castrated, flayed alive, beheaded, and their bodies displayed on a gibbet. For the daughters-in-law, the consequences were devastating. Marguerite was imprisoned in Château Gaillard, where she died, possibly murdered by strangulation, the following year. Blanche was forced into a convent after her marriage was annulled. Though Joan was eventually acquitted, her reputation was permanently damaged. While these women were technically Philip's daughters-in-law rather than his daughters, his willingness to destroy their lives for political gain reveals a man for whom family relationships were merely tools to be used and discarded. For his actual daughters, Isabella, later Queen of England, and Margaret, Duchess of Brabant, the message was clear. Their father valued them only insofar as they advanced his political ambitions, and would sacrifice them without hesitation if necessary. Sancho VI of Portugal, r. 1223 to 1248, demonstrated how paternal cruelty could extend beyond one's own children to one's brothers, creating cycles of family violence that perpetuated themselves across generations. After inheriting the Portuguese throne as a teenager, Sancho's reign was characterized by conflict with the church and the nobility, eventually leading to civil war. Most disturbing was Sancho's treatment of his brothers, particularly Afonso. Fearing that they might become rivals for his throne, Sancho had his brothers imprisoned in conditions so harsh that they nearly died. Afonso managed to escape to France, where he gathered support for a rebellion against his brother. When Pope Innocent IV declared Sancho unfit to rule in 1245, Afonso returned to Portugal and defeated his brother in the civil war that followed. Sancho was forced into exile in Toledo, where he died in 1248. Afonso, now King Afonso III, would go on to become one of Portugal's most successful monarchs, but the experience of being persecuted by his own brother left psychological scars that influenced his own approach to family relations. The contrast between Sancho's failure as a brother and guardian and Afonso's later success as a ruler illustrates how the cycles of family violence could be broken, but also how rare such breaks were in medieval royal families. Sancho's legacy as a brother-turned-persecutor stands as a warning about how easily familial bonds could be corroded by power and suspicion. Frederick II Hohenstaufen, r. 1198 to 1250, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, was one of the most fascinating figures of the medieval period. Known as the wonder of the world for his intellectual curiosity and cultural patronage, Frederick also had a darker side that emerged in his treatment of his sons, particularly Henry VII and Enzo. Henry, Frederick's eldest son from his first marriage, was appointed King of Germany, while Frederick focused on his Italian territories. As Henry matured, however, he began to chafe under his father's tight control and restrictive policies. When Henry rebelled in 1232, seeking alliances with the German princes and Lombard cities against his father, Frederick responded with characteristic ruthlessness. Luring Henry to a meeting with promises of reconciliation, Frederick had his son arrested, stripped of his royal title, and imprisoned. Henry spent the remainder of his life, 7 years, in various fortresses in southern Italy, often kept in harsh conditions, and moved frequently to prevent rescue attempts. His despair was so great that in 1242, while being transferred to yet another prison, Henry threw himself from his horse onto rocks below, committing suicide at age 31. Frederick's treatment of his illegitimate son Enzo was similarly harsh. Captured by the Bolognese in 1249, Enzo could have been ransomed, but Frederick refused to pay or negotiate for his release. As a result, Enzo remained imprisoned in Bologna for 23 years until his death, abandoned by the father he had loyally served. For a man renowned for his learning and cultural sophistication, Frederick's cruelty toward his sons reveals the limitations of medieval enlightenment. When it came to family relations, even the wonder of the world could be as brutally pragmatic as any other medieval ruler, sacrificing his children's welfare to political expediency. Ivan IV Vasilievich, known as Ivan the Terrible, r. 1547 to 1584, stands as perhaps the most notorious paternal monster in Russian history. While his reign saw the formal recognition of Moscow's supremacy and the expansion of Russian territories, it was also marked by increasing paranoia, mental instability, and brutal purges. Ivan's most infamous act as a father occurred in 1581. His daughter-in-law, Yelena Sheremeteva, wife of his heir Ivan Ivanovich, was pregnant when the Tsar confronted her about what he considered immodest dress. In a fit of rage, Ivan beat her so severely that she miscarried. When his son heard his wife's screams and confronted his father, the ensuing argument turned violent. In a moment of uncontrolled fury, Ivan struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff. The blow proved fatal. The Tsarevich died 4 days later. According to witnesses, the elder Ivan threw himself to the floor in grief, screaming, "May I be damned! I've killed my son! I've killed my son!" The Tsarevich briefly regained consciousness long enough to forgive his father before succumbing to his wound. The death of his heir sent Ivan into a deeper spiral of depression and instability. With his capable heir dead, the throne would eventually pass to his younger son Fyodor, who was intellectually disabled and incapable of effective rule. Ivan's killing of his son thus not only destroyed his family, but set Russia on a path toward the time of troubles, a period of crisis and civil war that nearly destroyed the Russian state. Ivan's case illustrates the catastrophic consequences that could follow when a ruler's mental instability and propensity for violence extended to his own family. The death of Tsarevich Ivan stands as one of history's most tragic examples of paternal violence, with consequences that would echo through Russian history for generations. Sviatopolk Orest Vladimirovich, R1 1015 to 1019, known to history as Sviatopolk the Accursed, earned his grim sobriquet through one of the most notorious fratricides in medieval Slavic history. While technically the murders were of his brothers rather than his children, Sviatopolk's actions represent one of the most extreme cases of familial violence in the early medieval period. Upon the death of his father, or possibly stepfather, Vladimir the Great in 1010-15, Sviatopolk seized power in Kiev. Fearing challenges from his brothers Boris and Gleb, who were popular and had stronger claims to the throne, Sviatopolk dispatched assassins to murder them. Both brothers, according to the primary chronicle, chose not to resist or flee when the killers came, accepting death rather than participating in fratricidal bloodshed. The murders of Boris and Gleb shocked medieval Rus. Both brothers were subsequently canonized as passion bearers by the Russian Orthodox Church, the first East Slavic saints, and became the subjects of an important cult. Their willing self-sacrifice in the face of their brother's treachery made them powerful symbols of Christian humility and non-resistance to evil. Sviatopolk's reign was brief and troubled. Challenged by another brother, Yaroslav the Wise, he was defeated and died while fleeing in 1019. His legacy was so reviled that chroniclers referred to him as Sviatopolk the Accursed or Sviatopolk the Damned, while Yaroslav, who defeated him, became Yaroslav the Wise and oversaw a golden age of Kievan Rus. The story of Sviatopolk illustrates how the violation of fraternal bonds, which in medieval society were supposed to be almost as sacred as the bonds between father and son, could lead to both earthly defeat and eternal condemnation in the historical record. His tale stands as a warning about the consequences of placing power above family loyalty, a warning that many subsequent rulers would ignore at their peril. Ahmad ibn Muhammad, known as al-Musta'in, r. 862-866, the Abbasid Caliph, presided over a period of increasing fragmentation and violence in the Islamic world. As Turkic military commanders gained increasing power in Baghdad, the caliphate began to lose effective control over its vast territories. In this turbulent context, al-Musta'in's personal paranoia and cruelty found expression in his treatment of his own sons. Fearing conspiracies and challenges to his authority, al-Musta'in became convinced that his sons were plotting against him with rival factions at court. Without conclusive evidence, he ordered their execution, personally witnessing their deaths to ensure his orders were carried out. This act of filicide shocked the Islamic world, where the Prophet Muhammad's teachings on the importance of compassionate treatment of children were well known. Al-Mustahin's own end was as violent as that he inflicted on his sons. Deposed in 866 after a prolonged siege of Baghdad, he was initially promised safe exile but was instead executed, his head sent to the new caliph as proof of his death. His brutal treatment of his sons had gained him no loyalty among the military or religious establishments, contributing to the ease with which he was overthrown. The case of al-Mustahin illustrates how, even in a cultural context with strong religious prohibitions against harming one's children, the corrupting effects of absolute power could lead rulers to overcome such moral constraints, often to their own ultimate detriment. Suleiman I, r. 1520–1566, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and in the East as Suleiman the Lawgiver, stands as one of the Ottoman Empire's greatest sultans. Under his rule, the empire reached its territorial zenith and cultural golden age. Yet behind this glittering legacy lies a dark chapter of paternal violence, motivated by the Ottoman succession system and harem politics. The Ottoman practice of fratricidal succession, where the new sultan would execute all his brothers to prevent civil war, created a system where princes knew that their ultimate fate would be either the throne or the executioner's bowstring. This brutal pragmatism reached its logical conclusion in Suleiman's treatment of his own sons. Influenced by his favorite concubine and later wife, Hurrem Sultan, Roxolana, Suleiman became suspicious of his eldest son, Mustafa, born to another concubine. Despite Mustafa's popularity among the military and his capabilities as a leader, Suleiman was persuaded that he represented a threat. In 1553, Suleiman lured Mustafa to his tent during a military campaign, where the prince expected a father-son conference. Instead, he found mute executioners waiting with silk bowstrings. Mustafa was strangled to death as his father watched from behind a screen. To complete the purge, Suleiman also ordered the execution of Mustafa's 5-year-old son, eliminating any potential rallying point for Mustafa's supporters. Later, conflict between Suleiman's 2 surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid, led to civil war. When Bayezid was defeated and fled to Safavid Persia, Suleiman negotiated with the Shah for his return, not to pardon him, but to execute him. In 1561, Bayezid and his 4 young sons were strangled to death in Qazvin before being returned to Ottoman territory for burial. Suleiman's willingness to sacrifice his sons and grandsons to the cold logic of imperial stability reveals how thoroughly the institution of monarchy could override paternal instincts. That such actions could be taken by a ruler otherwise known for justice and cultural refinement illustrates the moral compartmentalization that allowed medieval rulers to be simultaneously enlightened patrons and monstrous fathers. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang China, r. 712–756, presided over what is considered the greatest era of the Tang dynasty, a golden age of cosmopolitan culture, economic prosperity, and territorial expansion. Yet his later years were marked by infatuation with his concubine Yang Guifei and increasing neglect of government, leading to the catastrophic Anlushan rebellion that nearly destroyed the dynasty. Less well known but equally tragic was Xuanzong's treatment of his son, Crown Prince Li Heng, later Emperor Suzong. As Xuanzong fell under the influence of Yang Guifei, he became increasingly suspicious of the Crown Prince, who represented the interests of the traditional court faction opposed to Yang's family's growing power. Convinced by Yang and her allies that his son was plotting against him, Xuanzong considered deposing and executing Li Heng. The situation came to a head during the Anlushan rebellion in 755. As rebel forces approached the capital Chang'an, Xuanzang fled with Yang Guifei and his court, abandoning the city. When the imperial entourage reached Mawei Station, the escort troops mutinied, blaming Yang Guifei for the disaster and demanding her execution. Xuanzang, prioritizing his own survival over loyalty to his beloved consort, acquiesced to their demands, allowing Yang to be strangled. Meanwhile, the crown prince Li Heng, left behind in Chang'an, managed to escape the rebels and establish a resistance government in Sichuan. Rather than supporting his son's efforts to save the dynasty, however, Xuanzang, bitter over Yang's death and mentally unstable, considered declaring Li Heng a usurper and ordering his execution. Only the intervention of loyal ministers prevented this final paternal betrayal. Eventually, Xuanzang was forced to abdicate in favor of Li Heng, who became Emperor Suzong and ultimately defeated the rebellion. The relationship between father and son remained poisoned, however, with Xuanzang resenting his forced abdication and Suzong never forgiving his father's willingness to sacrifice him for a concubine. The case of Xuanzang illustrates how personal infatuation could corrupt a ruler's judgment to the point where he would consider destroying his own son and heir. Prioritizing a romantic attachment over both filial bonds and imperial stability. That the Tang dynasty survived this crisis was despite, not because of, Xuanzang's actions as a father. Yangzhou of Joseon, r. 1724–1776, was one of Korea's longest reigning and, in many ways, most accomplished monarchs. His policies of tax reform and magnificent harmony between political factions brought stability to a kingdom that had been riven by partisan strife. Yet this enlightened ruler was also responsible for one of the most notorious filicides in Korean history. Yongzhou's son, Crown Prince Sado, appears to have suffered from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. As he matured, Sado exhibited increasingly erratic and violent behavior, including unprovoked assaults on servants, sexual violence, and bizarre compulsions, such as an obsessive fear of certain colors and clothing. The relationship between father and son deteriorated into a cycle of disappointment, rage, and fear. Yongzhou, a strict Confucian, was horrified by his son's behavior, which violated every principle of proper conduct. Sado, desperate for his father's approval, was driven further into mental instability by Yongzhou's constant criticism and rejection. The breaking point came in 1762, when Yongzhou became convinced that his son was not merely unstable, but actively plotting treason. Unable to directly execute the crown prince without violating Confucian principles of filial harmony, Yongzhou resorted to an extreme measure. He ordered Sado to climb into a large rice chest and had the lid nailed shut. For 8 days, the crown prince remained imprisoned in this makeshift coffin in the blistering summer heat, begging for water and forgiveness until he finally died of starvation and suffocation. Yongzhou, supposedly overcome with grief yet convinced of the necessity of his actions, ordered court musicians to play loudly during his son's ordeal to drown out his cries. The rice chest incident remains one of the most chilling examples of filicide in royal history. That it was committed by a ruler otherwise known for wisdom and compassion illustrates the extreme psychological pressures that could warp the father-son relationship in traditional monarchies, where expectations of perfection and fears of dynastic instability could override paternal love and basic humanity. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, r. 1325–1351, Sultan of Delhi, was one of medieval India's most controversial rulers. Contemporary chronicles describe him as a complex figure, highly educated, physically strong, and with grand ambitions for reform, yet also prone to fits of extreme cruelty and impulsive decision-making that earned him the nickname the Bloody Sultan. Among his many acts of violence, perhaps none was more shocking than his treatment of his son, or possibly his nephew. Historical accounts differ. According to the chronicles, the young prince made a comment at court that the Sultan perceived as disrespectful or challenging to his authority. Muhammad bin Tughlaq's response was immediate and horrifying. He ordered the prince to be flayed alive before his eyes. The public nature of this execution, performed in front of the assembled court, served as a terrifying demonstration that not even the Sultan's own blood was exempt from his wrath. It sent a clear message to potential rivals or critics. If the Sultan would not spare his own son, he would certainly not hesitate to eliminate anyone else who crossed him. This act of paternal savagery contributed to the atmosphere of terror that characterized Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign. Despite his intellectual gifts and ambitious reforms, including an attempted currency reform and the controversial transfer of his capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, his legacy was permanently tainted by his reputation for capricious cruelty, epitomized by the horrific execution of his son. The case of Muhammad bin Tughlaq illustrates how, in medieval Islamic court culture, no less than in other traditions, a ruler's perception of his absolute authority could override even the most basic paternal instincts of protection and care, with traumatic consequences for both family members and the broader political culture. Many of the worst fathers in medieval history exhibited symptoms consistent with what modern psychology would identify as paranoid personality disorder or paranoid features within other personality disturbances. This paranoia was often exacerbated by the genuine dangers of medieval political life, where assassination and usurpation were constant threats. Ivan the Terrible exemplifies the paranoid father. Having experienced betrayal and danger from childhood, his mother was likely poisoned when he was 8. Ivan developed an extreme sensitivity to perceived threats. This paranoia intensified following a near-fatal illness in 1553, after which he became increasingly suspicious even of those closest to him, including his son. For paranoid fathers, children represented both dynastic continuity and potential threats. The presence of an adult, capable heir could attract the support of discontented nobles or foreign powers seeking to depose the ruling monarch. In the distorted thinking of these paranoid rulers, filicide could seem a rational response to perceived conspiracy, a preemptive strike against imagined treason. The isolation inherent in absolute power further enabled paranoid thinking. With few people willing to contradict or question the monarch, there were limited reality checks on increasingly delusional beliefs. When courtiers, seeking favor, reinforced the ruler's suspicions about his children, the stage was set for tragic outcomes. Many medieval royal fathers exhibited what would now be recognized as pathological narcissism. For these rulers, children existed primarily as extensions of themselves, as instruments for dynastic continuation, and as reflections of their own greatness. When children failed to fulfill these narcissistic expectations, the father's rage could be terrible. Emperor Xuanzong's treatment of his son reflects this narcissistic dynamic. Initially proud of Crown Prince Li Heng, Xuanzong turned against him when the son opposed the father's infatuation with Yang Bifei. The son's independence of judgment was experienced by the narcissistic father as personal betrayal, justifying in Xuanzong's mind even execution. For narcissistic fathers, children's achievements could also provoke envy and fear. A son who showed too much military prowess, who became too popular with the nobility or the army, risked triggering his father's insecurity. Suleiman the Magnificent's execution of his capable son Mustafa reflects this dynamic. The father could not tolerate being overshadowed by his son, especially when courtiers began to make comparisons favorable to the younger man. The narcissistic inability to recognize children as separate individuals with their own legitimate needs and perspectives made these fathers particularly dangerous. Unable to empathize with their children's suffering, they could inflict or order horrific punishments without experiencing appropriate remorse or restraint. Not all paternal failures in medieval royalty were as dramatic as execution or imprisonment. Many royal fathers were physically or emotionally absent, delegating child-rearing entirely to nurses, tutors, and governors. This emotional detachment, while less obviously cruel than active abuse, could still inflict profound psychological damage. Henry II of England exemplifies the absent royal father. Constantly on the move throughout his vast domains, Henry rarely saw his children for more than a few weeks each year. His sons, later known as the Devil's Brood for their rebellions against their father, grew up with little personal connection to Henry, knowing him primarily as a distant authority figure rather than as a nurturing parent. The consequences of this emotional neglect were profound. Henry's sons, starved of paternal attention and approval, became increasingly desperate to prove themselves and secure their inheritance, eventually rebelling against their father in alliance with their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The resulting family civil wars weakened Henry's realm and contributed to the early death of his eldest son, Henry the Young King. Even when physically present, many royal fathers remain emotionally detached from their children, viewing them through the lens of dynastic politics rather than personal relationships. Children raised in this emotional vacuum often develop their own psychological disturbances, perpetuating cycles of dysfunction across generations. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval paternal cruelty is how frequently it created intergenerational cycles of trauma and abuse. Sons who survived their fathers' mistreatment often grew up to inflict similar or worse cruelty on their own children, perpetuating patterns of dysfunction across multiple generations. The case of the Ottoman dynasty illustrates this dynamic. Mehmed the Conqueror, having narrowly escaped execution by his father Murad II, institutionalized fratricidal succession in Ottoman law. His son Bayezid II was in turn threatened by his own son Selim, who forced his father's abdication. Selim's son, Suleiman the Magnificent, executed his own son Mustafa. Each generation, having experienced paternal betrayal, seemed compelled to reenact it. Psychological research suggests that children who witness or experience violence often normalize such behavior, seeing it as an inevitable aspect of family relationships. Medieval royal sons, raised in environments where violence was the default response to conflict, learned these patterns early and deeply. When they became fathers themselves, many lacked alternative models for managing family tensions. Additionally, many royal sons carried unresolved rage toward their abusive or neglectful fathers. Unable to express this rage directly toward the all-powerful patriarch, they displaced it onto subordinates, including, eventually, their own children. Thus, the traumas of one generation became the cruelties of the next, in a dark inheritance of pain. The consequences of medieval paternal cruelty extended far beyond individual families, sometimes altering the course of entire civilizations. When rulers murdered or incapacitated capable heirs, they often condemned their realms to instability, civil war, or conquest. Ivan the Terrible's murder of his capable son, Ivan Ivanovich, led directly to the succession of the mentally limited Fyodor I, whose inability to rule effectively created a power vacuum filled by Boris Godunov and ultimately led to the Time of Troubles, a 15-year period of famine, foreign invasion, and civil war that nearly destroyed the Russian state. Similarly, King John's abusive treatment of his nephew Arthur and general neglect of his son Henry contributed to the loss of the Angevin Empire and decades of instability in England. Henry V's premature death left his infant son Henry VI unprepared for kingship, leading to the disasters of the 100 Years' War and ultimately the Wars of the Roses. These cases illustrate a grim historical irony. Rulers who justified their cruelty toward their children in the name of dynastic security often undermined the very stability they sought to preserve. By destroying capable heirs or creating traumatized successors, these fathers weakened their dynasties and realms, sometimes fatally. The traumatic relationship between fathers and sons in medieval royal families found expression in the literature and folklore of the period. From the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac to the Arthurian legends, medieval culture was permeated with narratives exploring the tensions between paternal authority and filial independence. The Norse myth of Odin and Thor, the Greek tragedy of Kronos devouring his children, the biblical account of David and Absalom. All these stories provided medieval audiences with frameworks for understanding the terrible dynamics they observed in their own royal families. Such narratives simultaneously normalized paternal violence as an inevitable aspect of power relationships, while also offering subtle critiques of such behavior. Particularly influential was the story of Constantine and his son Crispus, which became a touchstone for medieval chroniclers describing later instances of filicide. When a ruler executed his son, comparison to Constantine was almost inevitable, though chroniclers often emphasized that, unlike Constantine, who supposedly repented, many later royal filicides showed no remorse for their deeds. By the late medieval period, theatrical representations of destructive father-son relationships became increasingly common. The story of Canute and his sons, the legend of King Lear dividing his kingdom among his daughters. These narratives allowed medieval audiences to process and make meaning of the dynastic tragedies they witnessed, creating emotional distance through artistic representation. This cultural processing of paternal cruelty demonstrates how thoroughly such violence permeated medieval thinking about power. Far from being aberrant exceptions, monstrous fathers were recognized as almost inevitable products of the medieval political system. Tragic figures whose power corrupted their most fundamental human relationships. While sons who displeased their royal fathers might face execution or imprisonment, daughters faced different but equally devastating consequences. For medieval princesses, the primary value lay in their marriageability, their ability to cement political alliances through advantageous marriages. Fathers who used their daughters as diplomatic pawns often inflicted profound trauma, even without resorting to physical violence. King John of England's treatment of his daughter Joan exemplifies this form of paternal cruelty. In 1209, when Joan was just 7 years old, John sent her to marry Hugh X of Lusignan as part of a peace settlement. However, when a better political opportunity arose, John broke the engagement and married Joan instead to Alexander II of Scotland. Throughout these negotiations, Joan's preferences and welfare were never considered. She was merely a commodity to be traded for political advantage. Similarly, Isabella of Valois was just 6 years old when her father, Charles VI of France, married her to the 29-year-old King Richard II of England in 1396. This child bride was sent to a foreign court where she could not speak the language, separated from her family and everything familiar. Though Richard apparently treated her with kindness and did not consummate the marriage due to her youth, the psychological impact of such displacement must have been severe. Even more traumatic was the fate of daughters whose fathers used them as hostages. King Ethelred of England gave his daughter Elfgifu to Viking invaders in 1002 as part of a peace agreement. Historical records are silent on her fate, but the psychological and likely physical abuse she would have suffered among those who had ravaged her homeland can be imagined. These invisible victims rarely feature prominently in historical chronicles, which focus primarily on sons as political actors. Yet the suffering of medieval princesses traded like property, often at extremely young ages, represents one of the most pervasive forms of paternal cruelty in the medieval period, a form of abuse so normalized that contemporaries rarely recognized it as such. The role of queens and royal mothers in relation to paternal cruelty was complex and often contradictory. Some mothers enabled or even encouraged their husbands' mistreatment of children, particularly stepchildren who threatened their own offspring's inheritance. Others risked everything to protect their children from paternal violence. Empress Fausta, second wife of Constantine the Great, apparently played a key role in the execution of Constantine's eldest son, Crispus. According to historical accounts, Fausta accused Crispus of attempting to seduce her, a fabricated charge intended to eliminate him as a rival to her own sons. In this case, the stepmother actively facilitated paternal violence, though she would later fall victim to Constantine's rage herself. Conversely, Eleanor of Aquitaine risked imprisonment to protect her sons from what she perceived as their father Henry II's unfair treatment. When Henry refused to grant their sons meaningful power or territories, Eleanor supported their rebellion against him, resulting in her 15-year imprisonment when the rebellion failed. Her willingness to sacrifice her own freedom in defense of her sons represents maternal resistance to paternal tyranny. The limited power of medieval queens meant that maternal protection could only go so far. When Isabella of France attempted to shield her son Edward III from the tyranny of her husband Edward II of England, she was ultimately forced into a rebellion that led to Edward II's deposition and probable murder. While she succeeded in protecting her son, the price was becoming reviled as the she-wolf of France who had betrayed her husband. These cases illustrate the impossible position of royal mothers caught between loyalty to abusive husbands and protection of vulnerable children. Their choices, whether to enable, resist, or attempt to mitigate paternal cruelty, were always constrained by the patriarchal power structures of medieval monarchy. Not all medieval rulers were monstrous fathers. Some managed, despite the corrupting influence of absolute power, to maintain loving, nurturing relationships with their children. These exceptional fathers demonstrate that paternal cruelty was not inevitable, even within the constraints of medieval monarchy. Alfred the Great of Wessex, r. 871 to 899, stands as perhaps the finest example of enlightened medieval fatherhood. Despite leading his kingdom through the Viking invasions and implementing sweeping cultural and administrative reforms, Alfred made time for his children's education and welfare. Believing deeply in the value of learning, he personally supervised his daughter's education alongside his son's, an extremely unusual practice in 9th century Europe. Most remarkably, Alfred prepared his eldest son, Edward, for kingship not through intimidation or harsh discipline, but through mentorship and gradual delegation of authority. In his later years, Alfred made Edward a partner in governance, allowing him to lead military campaigns and administer justice. This apprenticeship approach created a smooth transition of power when Alfred died, and Edward the Elder proved a worthy successor to his father. Alfred's enlightened approach to fatherhood extended beyond his own children to include the careful education of his nephews, the sons of his deceased brother. Rather than viewing these boys as potential rivals to his own sons, Alfred raised them as part of his family, eventually restoring them to their patrimony in Mercia under his son's overlordship. The success of Alfred's methods is evident in the accomplishments of his children. His daughter Ethelfled became the renowned Lady of the Mercians, ruling that territory effectively after her husband's death. His son Edward continued Alfred's programs of defense and cultural revival. Even Alfred's grandchildren proved exceptional rulers, suggesting that his positive parenting style created intergenerational benefits for his dynasty and kingdom. Charlemagne, r. 768 to 814, founder of the Carolingian Empire and first Western emperor since the fall of Rome, presents a more complex model of medieval fatherhood. In many ways, Charles was an extraordinarily indulgent father, particularly toward his daughters, whom he refused to allow to marry because he could not bear to be parted from them. While this refusal to arrange marriages for his daughters might seem selfish, denying them the opportunity to have legitimate families of their own, contemporary accounts suggest a genuinely affectionate relationship between Charles and his children. His biographer Einhard describes how the emperor delighted in his children's company, even taking his daughters with him on military campaigns, rather than being separated from them. Toward his sons, Charles was a conscientious educator and delegator of authority. As his sons matured, he appointed them sub-kings over various portions of his vast empire, giving them real responsibility while maintaining overall supervision. When his eldest son Pepin the Hunchback rebelled in 792, Charles showed unusual mercy by commuting his death sentence to confinement in a monastery, a stark contrast to the filicides committed by later rulers facing filial rebellion. Charles's greatest failure as a father was perhaps his indecision regarding imperial succession. By not clearly designating his third son Louis as heir until very late in his life, Charles created uncertainty that might have led to civil war had he not outlived all but one of his legitimate sons. Nevertheless, the generally positive relationships between Charles and his children, and his preference for affection over intimidation, mark him as an exceptional father by medieval royal standards. The catalogue of paternal horrors recounted in this exposé raises a profound question. Is the combination of absolute political power and healthy fatherhood inherently impossible? The evidence from medieval history suggests that power does indeed corrupt the paternal relationship in predictable ways, though not inevitably or uniformly. The structure of medieval monarchy created specific pressures that worked against healthy father-son relationships in particular. When sons were also heirs and potential rivals, the natural developmental process of the son separating from the father and establishing his own identity became politically threatening. Every son's maturation reminded the father of his own mortality and the approaching transfer of power, a prospect many aging monarchs found intolerable. For daughters, the problem was different, but equally damaging. Their value as diplomatic assets often overrode any consideration of their personal welfare or happiness. A princess's primary purpose was to advance her father's political interests through marriage, regardless of her age, preferences, or the character of her husband. Yet the exceptions, rulers like Alfred the Great and Charlemagne, who maintained generally positive relationships with their children despite wielding enormous power, demonstrate that the corruption of fatherhood by power was not inevitable. These exceptional fathers suggest that personal qualities of empathy, emotional security, and moral restraint could overcome the structural pressures toward paternal cruelty. While the specific forms of paternal cruelty documented in this exposé belong to the medieval period, the psychological dynamics they reveal have disturbing modern parallels. Contemporary studies of dictators and authoritarian leaders frequently reveal similar patterns of familial dysfunction, suggesting that tyranny in the public sphere often begins with or is reflected in tyranny at home. The cases of medieval royal monsters, men who could order the execution of their children one moment and conduct affairs of state the next, illuminate the compartmentalization that enables political violence on a larger scale. The ruler who learns to suppress natural empathy toward his own offspring can more easily suppress empathy toward subjects, enemies, or conquered populations. This connection between private and public tyranny was recognized even in the medieval period. When chroniclers described rulers as cruel toward their own blood, this was understood as the ultimate demonstration of a fundamentally tyrannical character. If a king would not spare his own child, what mercy could ordinary subjects expect? The worst fathers in medieval history thus serve as cautionary examples, not only about the corrupting effects of power on family relationships, but about the intimate connection between personal and political morality. Their stories remind us that the capacity for cruelty or compassion in the private sphere inevitably shapes the exercise of power in the public realm. A lesson as relevant in the 21st century as it was in medieval times. In cataloging the horrific acts of medieval royal fathers, this exposé has not aimed merely to condemn or sensationalize. Rather, its purpose has been to understand the complex factors, psychological, political, cultural, and institutional, that transformed men who should have been protectors into predators who destroyed their own offspring. These men were products of their time and circumstances, operating within cultural frameworks that normalized violence and within political systems that treated children as assets rather than individuals deserving protection and nurture. Many were themselves survivors of childhood trauma, perpetuating cycles of abuse they had experienced as children. Understanding these contexts does not excuse or justify filicide, imprisonment, or the use of children as political pawns. Rather, it helps explain how such behaviors became not merely possible, but, in some royal courts, almost routine. By examining these extreme cases of paternal failure, we gain insight into both the specific dysfunctions of medieval monarchy and the universal human susceptibility to corruption by power. The worst fathers in medieval history stand as tragic figures, men whose power gave them the capacity to act on their darkest impulses without restraint, and whose actions left legacies of trauma that shaped history. Their stories, disturbing as they are, form an essential part of our understanding of the medieval world and of the timeless challenges of balancing power with humanity, authority with compassion, and political necessity with moral obligation. In the final analysis, these royal monsters remind us that the most fundamental test of character is not how one treats equals or superiors, but how one treats those over whom one has complete power. By this measure, many of history's most exalted rulers stand condemned, not by modern standards, but by the basic human obligation to protect rather than destroy one's own children.